Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl, currently in Aotearoa, New Zealand, at the annual Motivational Interviewing Conference. Welcome back to Compassion in a T-shirt, where we explore how compassion is not just something we feel or think, but something we can actually embody. Today, I'm excited to introduce our guest, Dr. Neil Clapton. Neil is a clinical psychologist based in the UK, working from a compassion-focused therapy perspective. He has a special interest in radically embodied compassion, an approach that integrates compassion with the physical body, and he's explored it through his work in martial arts. Alongside his colleague, Dr. Syd Hiskey, who was a guest on Compassion in a T-shirt way back in February 2021, Neil co-founded Fierce Compassion Martial Arts, blending compassionate practice with martial arts training, embodying the wisdom, strength, and courage of compassion, and helping people channel difficult emotions into constructive, compassionate action. We'll be discussing this innovative fusion of mind and body and how it can transform our approach to compassion in therapy and everyday life. And he gets me up and practicing. So I bring you Dr. Neil Clapton. Well, Dr. Neil Clapton, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Wonderful to be here, Stan. I feel very honoured and privileged to join you today and see your lovely face and get into some cool stuff about radically embodied compassion together.
Absolutely, and I must say that it is quite a joy for me as well to get to chat to an old friend. But actually, let's start there. What is radically embodied compassion?
Good question, Stan. So when we talk about radically, we really mean totally, completely, all the way with one's entire body, mind, spirit, or soul, whatever you want to call it. So we're talking about compassion in a deeply embodied sense. Because if we think about certainly from a compassion-focused therapy perspective, but also a more general compassion perspective, there's general consensus that the core of that is courage and wisdom. And, courage and wisdom are rooted and grounded in the body. So if we think about how we try and really tap into those things and stimulate those things, we've evolved systems in us, in our bodies and our minds, to be able to tap into and stimulate and access those things. So radically embodied compassion really is about that. How do you reconnect with what's in the body to stimulate compassion, motivation, and the courage and wisdom that goes with it? So to coin a lovely quote from one of my good friends and somebody who's been to our training workshops, I remember her saying to me that it's much easier to connect with the qualities of courage and strength and wisdom in our bodies than it is to think our way into those qualities. Now, that obviously that doesn't mean that we can't, but if you have an embodied experience of that being rooted in your physical being, arguably it's much easier to translate that to a mental, internal, psychological process in your mind. And there's the idea that there's this concept of the preparatory set, so that's like the integrated readying of an organism to respond to the environment for action. So you can use the principles of embodiment, like posture, attention, movement, to prime and ready yourself to respond in a certain way. So if we think about social mentality theory in compassion-focused therapy, for example, what we're doing there is trying to prime and ready the social mentality for affiliation and cooperation. So that's the thing that we're trying to use our body to describe, that psychophysiological motivational state of compassion.
Right. It's sort of radically because it's sort of wholly. It's embodied in that it's really rooted in the body, and it's compassion. It's kind of preparing ourselves to, I guess, move towards suffering and try to be helpful. And yeah, that's a really interesting idea. Sort of thinking our way to it is sort of one thing. Even using some of the other strategies of imagery and so on that we might use in CFT and other approaches is kind of another thing. But there's something very powerful in the body, in the embodiment
Mm.
of it, and the practices. How might you do that? What are the sorts of things that really start to activate things in that embodied way?
Um, I mean, there's a whole range of things you can do. You know, we'll be talking about martial arts later because that's my particular area of interest. Um, but you know, the world of embodiment has lots of ways of being able to tap into that. You know, yoga is obviously a powerful example of people being able to tap into those processes and stimulate that neurophysiological and motivational state. Um, uh, and you know, body psychotherapy has known that for a long, long time, right?
Mm,
And that's a
mm.
tradition that has known about this for a long time, and perhaps doesn't get the recognition it deserves for that. So, you know, there's lots of ways of being able to hold oneself and move um, that might tap into compassion and motivation and the flow of compassion.
Mm.
Um, there's all sorts of activities. You know, I'm not being evasive here. I'm just being honest about the breadth of stuff that we could probably talk about that might be radically embodied compassion. You know, we'll be
Yes.
talking about a specific way of doing it, and maybe we'll even do a little bit of a physical practice. Stan, if you're
No.
up for it.
Yeah. No, that sounds fun. But yeah, I guess what you're saying here is that there's many ways into this kind of notion, and in fact, I think you said how you might hold and move the body in a sense, and so there might be yoga practices or acting kind of techniques or other physiological body-based practices, the breathing even, or other
Yep.
postural sorts of practices. Even kind of moving about the chair work, all of that, I guess, by the sounds of it, might come under this sort of embodied concept. Um,
Yeah.
why do we need it? What is it that, kind of really requires that really radically embodied compassion? Where do you see it playing the role?
Um, Well, I think that we'll get onto this if we talk about ruptures in the therapeutic alliance. But if you think about some of the particularly work for us as therapists, if we keep it for therapists at the moment, and then we can think about it more broadly. But when you're engaging with very difficult things and people's distress, um, you know that people are, you know, lots of people, lots of therapists are very good at that, but when the degree of kind of distress and threat is very high, that's a very difficult thing to like. Compassion then is quite a difficult thing physiologically to keep online in those situations. So that's when kind of, if you think about new brain abilities, because they're really important, um, your ability to use your new brain in perhaps the most effective way is going to be compromised under high threat. We know that, right? That's common to CFT and other psychotherapies. We know about what threat physiology and processing does to our new brain abilities. Um, so that's when you can really use the body to switch into and switch on the physiology that you need to continue to use your new brain abilities. So
Mm.
that's nothing, you know, that's nothing new really. That's something that we're probably all quite familiar with in CFT and other psychotherapies. Um, but those are the times when sort of your skills and your wisdom that you might need to access and enact might be more vulnerable to breaking down. It's that idea of maintaining your courage under fire, right? When you really need it. And keeping your executive functioning abilities when you're under pressure, because that's a much more difficult thing to do. Your physiology is going to go offline in a threat focused way then, and you can really reground and root yourself in the body then to help you stay where you need to. So you're more like your compassion, as it were, is likely to be more resilient and available to you and others when you really, really need it. If you're really rooted in embodied practice and radically embodied compassion.
Yes, because compassion's no small thing, really, is it? I suppose, and this is sometimes the conversation, isn't it, that we might have with people about what is compassion, and the recognition that it's actually it's about suffering, and it's about being able to approach suffering and have that compassion sort of remain available even under
Mm.
fire, as you said, even when it is very painful or distressing, and in many psychotherapists, we're working with people during some of the worst days of their life, in a sense. They're really going through very, very, very difficult suffering. We might even be resonating with that kind of pain that they're going through, and personal distress for the therapist is kind of something that might motivate us away from compassion, I
Mm.
suppose. And so radically embodied compassion is really about how to keep that compassion available to us and how to keep it resilient, even during some of those toughest moments with another person.
Absolutely, you've nailed it on the head there, Stan. I couldn't have said it better myself. And if you think about lots of embodied practice and radically embodied compassion in particular, you're finding ways to keep your approach and engagement motivation online, right? That's really what you want to be able to do. Um, which, like you said, is no small task. Even if we have a lovely intention to do that, being able to do that in the really trickiest moments is hard, and I think that's an important thing for us to remember. Psychotherapy, both for clients and for therapists, is an act of courage. You're going to places that are hard to go, um, and we do that together, and we need to use all of our selves to be able to do that, and that's no small task, as you say.
Mm.
Um,
Yes, I was thinking that, whether it be sort of firefighters or police or military kind of doing sort of kind of peacekeeping operations, for example, or maybe a surgeon, doing surgery, or perhaps a community worker kind of going out to work with people living on the streets, or these are all kind of acts of compassion that really require a lot of that strength and courage and the wisdom, as you say, and but also, yeah, there's sort of some kind of resilience thing there too,
mm,
maybe, or keeping that compassion going. But also psychotherapy, yeah. So you wrote a paper with the wonderful Syd Hiskey, who, the paper was called Radically Embodied Compassion Training, Cultivating Psychotherapist Courage, Distress Tolerance, and Compassionate Responsiveness via Traditional Martial Arts.
Nice and short title, hey?
Very, I don't think, oh no, there is a colon. Yes, very good. There's a colon. Um, but that paper sort of focuses on a particular angle with this, in that the relational challenges that might arise in therapy, the sort of the disaffiliation, or the rupture or conflict that might arise in a therapy relationship, and the way that radically embodied compassion might sort of be helpful there, perhaps, I guess, in terms of rupture repair. But as you say, there's a lot of work on that too, in terms of how we might sort of work with that. But but perhaps this radically embodied compassion has a role. So can you set the scene a little bit there in terms of psychotherapy and some of those more
Mm,
relationally challenging moments that we might all face?
yeah, I think some of this was born out of when Sid and I met years back and started to have conversations about this. Um, I think that that's where our conversation started to coalesce around. Really, is that actually, many of the stuff that we face with in therapy is around motivational conflict, um, and that's both interpersonal and intrapersonal. It's between other people and it's within ourselves. So you're finding ways to try and negotiate, navigate, and resolve conflict all the time. People are going to be bringing that to the therapy space. That's going to play out internally and between you. Um, and having both come from a long training history of engaging in the martial arts, we were absolutely convinced that that made us more compassionate and more effective therapists and better human beings. And so we were really interested in how we could apply this to not just therapeutic ruptures, but because, as you mentioned, there's a wonderful, rich research on alliance ruptures. Jeremy Safran, bless his soul, who's no longer with us, um, John Christopher Moran and Christine Eubanks, and loads of other people have done amazing research on ruptures in therapy, and that really compassionate stance of they're inevitable, right?
Mm.
They're inevitable. They're not, they're not avoidable. And the more you try to avoid them, the worse things are going to get.
Yes.
um, and I think also when Sid and I were reflecting on it, some of the best work we've done and then perhaps the most transformative work has come out of being able to resolve and repair ruptures in the alliance. So that's really where that we started to target this and think how there's so much within the martial arts and in training radical embodied compassion, which we'll come on to, that resonates with what you do in rupture repair work.
Mm.
And we can dive into that loads. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, that principle that ruptures are inevitable, conflict is something that is something you're working with all the time in the therapy space, and you're always trying to embody and enact helpful, non-violent, peaceful ways of resolving conflict internally and externally.
Mm.
Um, so
Mm.
that's kind of where the
Mm.
idea for that started and kind of evolved from, really.
And it's all sort of threat system activating for both parties, isn't it?
Mm.
As you know, I'm a two-trick pony. I love CFT and I love motivational interviewing. And I suppose my motivational interviewing hat kind of came on because, that's what MI was often about too,
Yeah.
there's always a bit of back and forth, to begin with and so, we're kind of navigating, negotiating, but then perhaps there might be a bit of discord too that arises, and then ultimately perhaps some sort of rupture, but there's conflict of one sort or another that weaves through it all, I suppose. And it is, it's as the therapist, you really want to do a good job, you want to be helpful, you want to kind of do something that actually, kind of has an impact, and you worry about the person you're working with. You worry about where they might head or what's going to happen to them if they don't do this thing, or if they don't sort of change or whatever. And so, often the therapist is just that little bit threat system activated, but then sort of so's the client because they're here and they're, this strange environment of the therapy room, for example, or whatever. And they're sort of thinking, oh my God, what am I going to have to do with all of this? And what do I have to talk about? And there's secrets I have to reveal. And so it's sort
Mm.
of, yeah, it's this sort of threat system relational thing that I guess is what you're working with.
Absolutely. Again, you having your uh, great experience and knowledge of both worlds is really helpful there, Stan. And you know, you describe how you have a felt sense of doing this all the time, but in your motivational interviewing work too.
Mm.
Um, and we are, you know, if you think about ruptures there, and where you know where you're trying to guide people towards and where they do and don't want to go, and that doesn't mean that means parts, right? You know, different parts of people are going to show up in the therapy space that have competing motives and needs because we're a complex, tricky, multi-motivational species. And trying to negotiate one's needs in relationship is what often brings people into therapy, right? It's like there's lots of unmet needs there. They're stuck in particular social mentalities, and they often haven't had an experience of. If you think about the absence of repair when there's been ruptures in it, particularly in attachment relationships, people often haven't had that experience of being able to repair ruptures because it's not been afforded to them. You know, harm's been done to them, or they've been neglected, or there's just been complete absence of a repair of those things. And you know, and this is crucial, right? Because that process of repairing ruptures are opportunities for growth and transformation. You know, that's a compassionately corrective, emotional, and relational experience for somebody. You know, Alan Shaw talked about this so much in the literature. If you've ever read Alan's stuff or seen him talk, amazing guy. When he's talking about right brain psychotherapy and the process of rupture repair, you know, he says, you know, misachievements aren't always technical mistakes.
Right.
They are, you know, they're inevitable. And if you think about what happens, you know, Ed Tronick talked about this, didn't he, with the still face experiments and the getting in and out of synchrony. You know, no, synchrony is not perfect all the time, and it's really about how you get back into sync, and then you create something new. You know, harmony can be restored, and then also that's really important for learning. Alan Shaw would say this about building resilience for negative affective states, right? That rupture repair process builds the inner structure and capacity to tolerate and regulate negative affect. So if you can look at ruptures like that and where you're trying to guide people to, there's all sorts of things out of that can be phenomenally corrective emotional and relational experiences. And then, you know, if anyone wants to is or isn't familiar with the rupture repair literature, there's so much out there which bears this out. You know, they did a big meta-analysis of, I think, 2018 around rupture repair and outcomes in psychotherapy, and lo and behold, the outcomes were better for those people able to repair ruptures. It wasn't about preventing them. Of course, you want to minimize the amount of ruptures you have, but having more isn't necessarily bad. It's about growth and transformation. The more you repair those things, the better. You know, people will drop less out of psychotherapy if you're able to do that. Their problems will not get worse. They won't get compounded. So, you know, it's very understandable that people get afraid and the threat system's going to get activated about ruptures. But fundamentally, if we can see them as an opportunity for healing, growth, and transformational change, we're onto something really important.
Music as a metaphor comes to mind in a way. The idea that you might have a kind of a slow build, and then, you know, at some point there's tension, you know, and something discordant there, which, you know, kind of piques the interest, and then there's, you know, sort of tension and release sort of thing, or tension and relief.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's kind of there's a whole journey across a musical piece. I'm thinking, you know, sort of about some of the highbrow jazz I used to get into, but and of
You and me
course
both, Stan.
yeah, and when you get through a sort of an experience like that, then there's the encore. You see, that's me We just want more. But you mentioned three kind of things that I wondered whether you could, and you've alluded to them, I think, the sort of the neuro physiological capacities, the embodied motivational switching abilities,
Mm.
and the somatic resources. And yeah, I wondered if you could just kind of elaborate a bit on those three.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it might maybe dive more into the martial arts here, but
Well, let's do that because the paper really was describing, I think, a kind of
yeah.
a program that you've developed to, I guess, to really tap into those three sort of areas of capacity or competency. So yeah, please do.
Yeah, so the martial arts is really rich for this, really, because particularly if we just stay with ruptures for a minute, uh, Jeremy Safran's work and his colleagues, Moran and Eubanks, they've really teased out this lovely kind of stage and process of how you resolve particular ruptures. Um, and that you can classify those into two types. There are of withdrawal markers for, that's much more about disengagement and disconnection, and then more confrontation markers, which are much more perhaps of overt kind of hostility. So
Mm.
that might be criticism from the client or demands or control, and there's different ways to resolve those things. But also the key that you need to be able to resolve those ruptures as a therapist are your ability to be self-aware and be as present within yourself and for the other. You need to be able to regulate the affect and distress that comes up for you and your client without responding with counter hostility or avoidance. Because there's a whole other thing we could get into there around transference and counter transference
Mm.
and unhelpful therapist responses to client communications, because they will throw you off balance. And if you're not prepared or don't know how to deal with that, that's a hard thing to navigate, and you can
Mm.
respond in a very unhelpful way, even if you don't intend to. Um, but you also need the skills of interpersonal sensitivity, right? You need to be able to communicate about what's going on in the interaction and in a rupture in an empathic way, so that it's made safe. You're maintaining your signaling of social safeness, uh, to be able to communicate that in as skillful a way as possible, in a way that they can receive and that they can be compassionately challenged about too, right? Because that therapy requires that balance of being able to be both validating and challenging in order for it to be most effective. Um, so martial arts gives us a really nice way to be able to do this because, first of all, particularly traditional martial arts, because they're embodied systems of conflict resolution, um, compassion is a central motivational force and tenet in traditional martial arts. Um, so they are integral to the philosophy and how you conduct yourself in the training and as a martial artist. The ultimate goal. There's a guy called Roy Kamen, who I think is the brother of the guy who wrote and directed The Karate Kid.
Oh, okay.
He wrote this brilliant book a couple of years ago because he's a martial artist, Roy Kamen, and he wrote this beautiful book called Karate Beneath the Surface, and really getting into the emotional and spiritual components of karate. And he says this lovely thing about martial arts isn't about learning how to fight, because that's a means to an end. The purpose is to become a fearlessly compassionate human being. That's really what you're trying to entrain. So,
Mm.
we can spend some time on how we do that in the martial arts, but that's the ultimate goal, really. You're entraining the body and mind to take action to alleviate suffering. So, anything can be misused, right? That might not resonate with lots of people's idea of martial arts, but traditional martial arts are rooted in that philosophy and that motivation. So lots of what you do in the martial arts really, when you get into it, is about halting suffering, Stan, right? It's about halting suffering in the least harmful way that you can, so that the highest ethical level of kind of combat in traditional martial arts is to do as least harm to your opponent as possible. You're always trying to avoid a conflict, or if you're having to engage with it, to stop it and halt it with as minimal harm to the self and other as possible. So look, all of those embodied systems are around how you do that in lots of different ways to halt suffering, which of course really joins up nicely with our motivation and intention in therapy and in life, which is to be able to turn towards rather than away from suffering, and to take action to alleviate it. So, so the bit that really we can take massively from martial arts is perhaps adding the halting bit, right? Because that's in alleviating suffering. But Syd and I would particularly add this idea of being able to halt suffering, right? It's taking a halting action. So it's having the strength and courage to halt suffering where you see it, where you can.
Yeah, that really is kind of a little bit, sort of mind-blowing for me, I think. I'm just sort of realizing the idea of sort of fearless compassion is really an interesting phrase, and that martial arts is all about having that strength and courage and wisdom to halt suffering, in self and others, and sometimes that means taking strong action, I guess, and sometimes that means taking very strong action. But there's always a sort of an intention to go only as far as I need to, and that once there, and once the sort of the suffering is halted or prevented and so on, then that's enough, sort of a thing. And so it's not something that comes along with anger, or at least anger in a kind of a hateful way, or a sort of a wanting to completely dispatch the sort of the enemy or something like that. But it's almost got a kind of the enemy is a friend, or the enemy is a human being, perhaps, and that we're all part of that. And so it's a kind of a necessary thing to, and we take it as far as is necessary, something like that.
Absolutely. The guy who founded Aikido, Morei Yeshiba, used to say, to injure another is only to injure oneself. Right? That's a really important philosophy in Aikido, and something we focus on in the martial arts, right? And the things that you are trying to defeat in one respect, it's yourself. It's getting out of your own way a lot of the time, right? If you think about therapy too, actually, a lot of the time, the stuff that gets in the way is our own shit.
That's the technical term, I think, isn't it?
So a lot of that is about how do you work with those parts of you and ensure that because they show up for a reason, but how do you not allow those things to take over, and that you stay rooted in your compassionate self to take the wise and courageous action. So you're absolutely right, and it is a bit mind blowing if you if you have you ever done any martial arts, Stan?
No, I'm not I haven't been a martial arts person. I've more been in the yoga world, but yeah. So it's
and I think I think it's often a revelation for people who haven't, but also who have. Right? Often some of this stuff isn't explicitly sort of. It's kind of implicit in lots of traditional martial arts, and perhaps isn't made more explicit. And I know I've had conversations with people who've done martial arts for a long time, who this has been like a a light bulb moment and things have clicked into place. They're like, I know this somewhere in my body, but
Mm.
I've never made that link to what it does for me in lots of ways.
Mm.
Um, so and if you think about so we'll talk about this when we get on to the workshop stuff, and
Mm.
but lots of that is around how do we use what we have in martial arts to directly transfer it to the therapy space and therapy
Mm.
process. So um, there's a guy called Drew Foster who wrote this brilliant paper in 2015 called Fighters Who Don't Fight, and it was a study about Aikido. Um, and this idea of at the time he called it somatic metaphorism, which was that it was a mode of deploying the body to make sense of challenges in non-martial spaces. So that's the idea that you take what you practice in the dojo, the training hall, and you can take it and generalize it to other aspects of your life, because what you train in martial arts, certainly from a traditional sense, the way, right? It becomes how you conduct the rest of your life, right? It's not limited to what you do on the mat. Um, I've got the Mandalorian ringing in my head now, Stan.
Yes, I do too. It came straight to mind. But
So
yeah.
so yeah, so that I so Sid and I then refine that to symphatic metamorphism, right? Which is that you're training your body to be different in conflict situations. So it's beyond a metaphor, right? It's an embodied and active and living thing. But what you train in the dojo, you're in training your body to respond differently to relational challenges and other challenges and adversity outside of the dojo. So it's not just a metaphor or a mode to deploy the body. You're transforming the body to do that in those situations that you
Yeah.
need it.
Yeah. No, I think that's the bit that did finally click for me when we had our conversation in where were we for that last Birmingham, that's
Birmingham.
right. Yeah. Was that it's not just a metaphor, actually. It's much more literal or physiological and motivational than that. It really is about cultivating capacities and system switching that then can
Yeah.
sort of, here's something I prepared earlier type of a thing, so that you're kind of able to respond in the moment, having done the practice, having done the training, and that's the piece, I suppose, about the physiological capacities and the motivational switching, and that all gets practiced and trained in the dojo, and then in the interpersonal relationship, when there's a kind of a moment where conflict or perhaps rupture arises, then those are the capacities that can come to the party.
Absolutely. And lots of stuff we do in the workshops, like stance work and guards and blocks, and then what you offer back, right? You move in from states that might be evoked in you. So like if you're trying to defend something coming into you and you block it, right? Your body position is a certain way. And then when you try and respond to that, you might go from a position of contraction to more openness, right?
Hmm.
So if you think about the processes that happen there, you're constantly monitoring and switching motivational state. Something will be evoked in you that might spike your threat system, but you're also in training the capacity via your body to not just react from that place, right? You can respond accordingly and very rapidly switch back to where you need to be. So, right,
Hmm.
if somebody it can be that can be a metaphor, but it's also physical. But for
Yeah.
something that comes your way, that you need to, because blocking also is about receiving, right? It's not always about smashing, right? Blocking is your ability to receive something.
Hmm.
You're in training lots of ways to take in what's coming your way safely without it hurting you, right? So you
Hmm.
stay in engagement distance with something. It's called Maya. We'll talk about this a bit more. But you stay in engagement distance with somebody, and then because of how you move and how you receive it, you're blending and absorbing with somebody's energy without being completely thrown off balance. You can position yourself to receive that and then offer something else in return, right? So if we think about that's you either trying to maintain your compassionate motivation via these embodied practices and stay centered, and from your center extend from that and offer your compassion back, rather than some kind of counter hostile or submissive response, right?
Mm. No, I love the
Trying to stay in
idea.
the pocket of compassion all the time.
Yes, yeah. And staying in the pocket of compassion, and also other motivational systems kind of being
Yeah.
kind of quite fluid in a way, able to
Mhm.
shift one way and then shift the other, and there's a kind of an efficiency to that. Perhaps we're not getting stuck in one, in a sense, but able to shift and so on as need be, with that kind of compassion umbrella or something, kind of the
Absolutely.
organizing system. Mm.
You've nailed it, because if you think about martial arts as a whole system, they're systems of integration and coordination. You're trying to integrate lots of parts of yourself to be aligned in a certain way and to
Mm.
shift in and out of stuff. Right? And that's important for life. It's great. You want the capacity to remain in synchrony with other people and yourself, but also not being like, it's not always great to be in sync if it's in the wrong mentality.
Mm. Yeah,
You need the flexibility to shift in and out of those things
yeah.
and get back to where you need to. That's healthy, right?
Mm.
It's not great to be stuck in one place. You need to be able to get in and out of sync with other people and with other parts of you.
Mm.
Because if you're stuck in one, you don't have the, I suppose ACT would call that psychological flexibility, right?
That was
So
the word that just popped to my mind
yeah.
as well. Yeah, martial arts perhaps is sort of helpful there with psychological flexibility.
But what you
So
try, if you think about posture and stance, right? You're trying that gives you both stability and flexibility. So that's you staying grounded and balanced and rooted in your compassionate self. That then affords you a wider range of responses. That's where you get your broader range of response repertoire from, because you're always trying to maintain a trade-off between balance and flexibility across emotional states.
mm,
So that's what something in the body really gives you. You deeply entrain this stuff so you can maintain your center when people are trying to throw you off balance all the time.
mm. So what is the radically embodied compassion training? I know that many people that I've heard, give very positive feedback about their experience, and I haven't had the chance to do it myself with you both, but yeah. So how does all of that work?
So, wonderful question. So at the moment, our sort of opening training is spread across 2 days. And what we do is break that down into kind of 3 phases. So that's broken down into kind of pre-session embodied practice, in-session embodied practice, and post-session. So it's a nice little roadmap and structure for therapy and what you do to warm up, how you perform, as it were, in session, and then how you warm down or wind down, or need to shake off stuff that you might be left with. So so in the pre-session stuff, lots of that stuff is around warming up your compassionate self, right? So our buddy Chris Irons talked about this a good few years ago. I don't know if you ever read a small article he wrote about this. I think he talked about athletes, and I think he talked about Serena Williams and
Mm. Oh,
how
yes. Yep.
she wouldn't dream of not warming up to play a match, right? And so one of our invitations at the start is to think about what do you do to get your compassionate self online and warm up before you start your therapy sessions? Do you do that? And also an invitation to notice some self-criticism that might come up, because sometimes we we're rushed and we're busy and we might not feel we have time, but what do we proactively do to bring that part of us online before we start? Yeah, I mean, at the risk of not trying to expose you, Stan, but what do you do before you start therapy? Do you, like at a session? Do you just rock up and like your compassionate self is ready to go? Because sometimes it might be, but like, do you do anything before sessions or particular clients that to kind of bring online and warm up your compassionate self?
Yeah, I sometimes sort of joke that, after my first skinny flat white, I can be really compassionate sort of thing. But I suppose the challenge for me is the sort of, the way that sessions happen one after another across the day. And so I do find that in that early part of the day or that first session, I feel quite ready and fresh, and I usually look over sort of the day and look over kind of the notes, and just kind of orient myself to the person and the kind of the previous work we've done, perhaps, or something like that. But it's kind of later on that I have to do things more actively. I definitely leave the session to sort of walk someone out, and then I like to go back into the room before inviting the next person in,
Yep.
just to stop, wipe down the whiteboard. Even if there's nothing on there, I tend to like to go through a little ritual.
Rituals, right? Rituals.
Yeah, and then a little bit of
Yeah.
breath work is usually the kind of the piece. But that's sort of it. I am someone who is a little bit back to back, so.
And again, that's to de-shame that and validate that because we are. But there are specific things we might be able to do with our body to kind of bring online our compassionate self and warm it up, like Chris has said. So some of those things are around, in martial arts, we have what are called ready stances or postures. And those are things about putting your body in a state of action readiness and ready to engage. And some of those things are around signaling to yourself and others your motivational intent. So, like, there's lots of salutes in martial arts.
Mm,
This is one example, right? If
mm,
you've got it, your hand covering your fist.
mm,
And this is about signaling care and protection, right? This is your strength.
mm,
This is the cover for that. My weapon is covered. I don't need to release this. I can feel the strength of my arm, but this is also my care and protection for
mm,
me and for you. I come in peace, right?
mm.
So there's all sorts of postures that, and a hand, that yoga would call these mudras, right? They are shortcuts and cues for certain motivational and emotional states, right?
Yeah.
They will prime those things, and there's plenty of research that shows that, right? There's uh, by doing this before stressful events, it lessens your anxiety and brings online parasympathetic predominance. So these are really helpful things for us to signal to ourselves and others what our intent is to start. Breathing and posture is another one. So how do you tend to do your soothing rhythm breathing, Stan? Do you have a particular way of doing that? Do you sit down? Is
I,
there anything in particular you add into that?
I quite like to do it standing up, and in a again, I sort of playfully think of it as my Marvel superhero pose sort of thing. It's not quite as dramatic as that, but kind of legs apart, shoulders back, kind of
Can
sort of
you can you show? Would you be willing to show me? Like, and
I
you don't have to, but
I,
like that
I
would be
think
great.
so. Luckily I am wearing pants, so oh,
Me too.
just let me go like uh, that, so I can just sort of see myself.
Brilliant.
Um, I don't know if you can hear me as well because I've stepped away from the mic a little bit, but yeah, sort of feet are flat on the ground, knees slightly bent, shoulders rolled
Yeah.
back, and hands just resting, chin up like that. And then I like to just sort of slightly just sort of keep the legs activated, slightly moving forward and back or to the side a little bit. Sometimes I might close my eyes and then just find a soothing rhythm breathing pattern of sort of in for 4, out for 4, something like that. And often just for 30 seconds or a minute before heading back out to find the next person.
Yeah. And what do you notice in your body about the difference between doing it standing versus, say, sat down? Like, what do you notice in your body and in your mind by doing it standing?
I find that it creates activation and
Yep.
energy for me. Whereas I'm sitting all day, of course, so I'm talking to people. And if I come back in and sit down, I feel heavier or floppier or something.
Yep.
Whereas
Yeah, yeah.
when I do it standing, it just sort of activates the body a little bit.
Absolutely, right. And in the East, they would talk about chi, right? And energy flow and different forms of energy. So you get a different kind of energy that's emerging and flowing through your body here, right? So, and that's not to say you can't, there isn't benefits to doing soothing rhythm breathing sitting, but it's a different experience, right? Standing rather than sitting.
Yeah.
So holding that stance, right? So something we do in the workshops called martial soothing breathing, right? Is so hold your stance. So as you breathe in, I want you to raise your hands up from near where your hips are towards, so just draw them up as you breathe in towards where your lungs and your heart are. And as you pause before you breathe out, and as you breathe out, turn your hands over and then push out, right? As you breathe out. So as you push out, as you exhale, push out until you reach the end of your breath, okay? Now, as you breathe in again, draw your hands back in, turn them over, pull them into fists, and pull them alongside your ribcage. And then as you breathe out, push your hands back down towards your hips, palms down, okay? So as you breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. I'm going to add some words as we breathe in, right? So as you breathe in, summon, issue, gather, contain. So as we breathe in, we summon compassion. We breathe out, we issue compassion. And as we breathe in, we're contained by compassion. Gathering in, sorry, gathering in, we're gathering in. See, I confused myself. And then we're contained by compassion. So we can summon, we can issue, we can gather in,
contain.
What does that feel like? I know it's a quick practice. You can sit down, Robin.
Yeah, I mean, I really, appreciate that the sort of the multiple layers there in a sense that, the sort of there's the stance, the body posture. There's there's the sort of the hold and move piece that you sort of mentioned right at the start. There's the body posture and the kind of the feeling of solidity and strength and a little bit of activation was still there for me. And then there's the move and kind of trying to kind of move the body in ways that kind of activate these different systems. And then there's the kind of little verbal element too that sort of creates a flow of meaning that can be attached, I suppose, to those movements. And I don't know, it feels strong, and I think I felt something which I don't really know how to describe, but it's something along the lines of um, strength and um, fullness and kind of solidity in the shoulders, the chest, that sort of area.
Absolutely, right. And we slow this all down in the workshop, right? As this is a preparatory exercise to ground and stabilize and center yourself and get that your compassionate self online and with its flowing as much as it can before getting people to slow down and notice that stuff, right? Because it's hard to put words to sometimes, and it's around you're able to tap into embodied qualities here that sometimes might be difficult to put a name on, right? But the ones that you picked out there were all around strength and stability and some form of embodied courage, right? The
Yeah.
readiness and preparedness to engage with something and not in a tense way, right? It's not all tensed up, and there's a different quality to it.
I
So
think
those
I
are
think
really
sorry, embodied. I just wanted to put a little pin on that because yes, I think embodied courage was the describes the word I was having trouble really finding. Like it is something that feeling full and but full of more courage. I think is probably right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Which according there's a study on this that show that if you do this kind of breathing in this movement paired way, that gives you a stronger and more resilient parasympathetic response than if you do either alone, right? So pairing those things together, and you're feeling that in your body. You're noticing that and feeling that in your physiology. And so again, these are really powerful ways to get this physiology that's associated with compassionate engagement and action up and running before we start a session. That you don't have to spend forever on this, but I frequently do this before my sessions. There are times when I'm really stretched and it's harder to do it. Nobody's perfect, but I notice the difference when I'm able to do this before a session. There was another study, I think from 2013, where they did a nice little study on pre-session centering practices and compared it to people who did and didn't. And the quality of the therapeutic presence that was reported by their clients was higher in those people who did the centering practice than those who didn't. So it's felt by the client when you go in.
Yes.
It will massively feed through to what happens in the therapy space. So that's kind of pre-session stuff that we do, Stan. Did you want to say something before we move on to sort of, I'll give you a very brief overview of kind of in-session and post-session stuff.
That was what I was going to sort of say. I was sort of thinking that the training kind of moves through the three phases, sort of because I think even in the Compassionate Mind training course that Chris Irons and Charlie Heriot-Maitland sort of developed, they do mention Serena Williams and they talk about the pre, during, and after. I think the PDA exercise they refer to, and
nice.
I guess that's exactly. I think that's that's similar. So yes, there's a kind of like during the session and then sort of after the session. So I was kind of curious to hear.
Yeah. So when we move into in session stuff, so lots of the exercises there are around how do we maintain our engagement distance with somebody. So I mentioned this concept of right? So that means, your engagement distance between yourself and another and the degree of harmony or disharmony in the interaction, right? So there's something around how synchronous or asynchronous are you in certain moments in session. So there's lots of exercises where we play with that, right? Because when people come into therapy, if you think about different phases of therapy, and about attachment functions. If you think about proximity seeking and secure base and safe haven stuff, people's ability to use that or tolerate that is going to vary at different points in therapy. And if you think about ruptures, people will withdraw sometimes or will come much closer. And And that could be for various different reasons, right?
Mm.
And your capacity to tolerate the amount of closeness and distance in therapy and your client is really crucial. You know, how do you navigate those moments for people to seek proximity to you safely, to use you as a safe haven, and then to use you as a secure base? Because there's going to be lots of fears, blocks, and resistances associated with each of those. So we do lots of exercises around, you know, if somebody pulls away from you, how do you stay in sync with them and still signal your availability using your stance, right? So, because that's a form of courage too. Like this, you know, if you think about static versus dynamic forms of courage, right? The ability to stay present and persevere, even if it's just staying there, you know, and holding what demonstrating that you're present and available so that you don't unintentionally abandon your client when they might invite you to, requires you to stay in a certain space, right? Because if you withdraw and give up or collapse, right, and you're like, oh, I'm off, they're left alone with stuff, right? And they might invite you to do that sometimes. So there's plenty of exercises where we get people to move back and forth and try and stay in a certain distance. So you're trying to stay in synchrony with something. So we'll get people to deliberately try and throw you off balance a bit. And you're right, the idea is about how do you get back in synchrony using your stance and body position. And there's a nice drill that we take from an Indonesian martial art called Carling, which has a lot of stick fighting. And it looks like patty cake. So you clap hands and you circle down and you circle back up again and then you swap hands. And the idea is, how do you stay in synchrony? And what do you do when you get out of it? And how does that feel? And how do you get back in sync? So there's lots of ways to how do you get in and out of sync that you can use martial arts drills for. Then we move into much more rupture, repair related stuff. So one particular exercise we'll do is that we'll simulate, say, a confrontation rupture, and that might be embodied as, say, somebody coming forward with a punch that as the client, right? That might be some kind of emotional attack or defense, right? Or it might be their resistance to the compassion that you're offering. And we'll teach people how to block that, to absorb it and receive it, and do that, say, 2 times, stepping backwards. And then instead of responding with a counterattack, at the end, the invitation is to respond with a compassionate countermeasure. So, rather than responding in a hostile way, you think about your motivational interviewing, you roll with the punches, you roll with the resistance, and then you're invited to offer something that might signal your compassion in that moment. That might just be a giving hand. That might be, it might just be being there and signaling safeness. It might be something, some people feel the need to put a hand on you and just reassure you that they're there. But it's in training that process of how do you get to reaffiliation at the end of the encounter, so that you have a felt experience of being able to manage the rupture, and that you and your client have an experience of being able to survive and reaffiliate. So it's a lovely drill, and people really enjoy that. And it invites people to be spontaneous about what comes out as their compassionate response and counter, right? Trust your embodied wisdom about what might be needed here. And that's going to vary, you know, it's going to vary on the situation that you're in about what you might need to offer and what you might not need to in that moment. Do you just need to be kind of more statically courageous and just stay there? Or do you need to be a bit more dynamic and offer something else? You know, is that an opportunity to redirect somebody somewhere else? Because a lot of it's about that, right? How do we redirect somebody back to where they might need to be in order to resolve their suffering? And then it's another exercise where, so you may have seen in martial arts and martial arts movies, you know, this the spirit yell, the ki or the kiap, you know, when people shout in martial arts. Have you ever seen that?
Yes.
So we get people to do a ki exercise too, and because that's really about harmonizing your energies and creating power, right? So it's a lovely exercise to help people find their compassionate spirit and voice. And you can grade that up from gentle to strong, dare I say, fierce. And you can experiment with that, right?
Mm.
You can expect, you know, how strong does your compassion need to be? Um, and see what comes out, right? What's it like when you let out your compassion full beans? Because you need that sometimes in therapy. Sometimes, you know, your compassion needs to be a lot quieter, you know, a lot more gentle, a lot more soft. And there are times when it really does not to be, it really needs to be amped up, right? Particularly in very dire situations, the intensity of your compassion needs to match and probably go above what's there suffering wise in order for
Mm.
things to be.
Mm.
So that's a really nice exercise for people to work with their own fears, blocks, and resistances to perhaps more assertive forms of compassion and a compassionate expression, because
Mm.
you get to experiment with what comes out and have free reign to play with it.
Mm. Mm. I can
And
imagine
then,
the energy there, sort of, especially brought to the halting of suffering, for
yes,
example. You know, that I can sort of imagine the combination of these forces from coming up from within, and
yeah,
the halting of suffering.
yeah, we do an exercise from Taekwondo, which is what I'm training, where you step in, where somebody you get somebody to throw a roundhouse, right? You step in, you hold the punch, and you put a halting hand on somebody's shoulder, and that's it, right? That's feel what it's like to hold suffering in this moment
Mm.
with
Mm.
your whole being, right? You're not trying to be aggressive there. You're moving towards because you have to step in to avoid getting clocked. You have to block here, and then you hold, right? You're not doing that with any judgment. You're doing that with your compassion driving everything. You know, just to
Mm.
hold and stop and say, let's hold this. Let's hold it.
Mm.
So what it really feels like to hold suffering, both in relation to others, and you can also translate that to yourself, right?
Mm. Yes.
And then, yeah, post-session stuff is really around uh, how do you, because sometimes you know between sessions you might be left carrying stuff, right? Lots of emotional stuff will come up, will have stimulated a lot in you, and you might need to either park that or let it go in order for it to free you up to move on to the next client. So, you know, the principle of biological completion is really important there, right? How do you complete something in order for your nervous system to reset and then move to somewhere else where it needs to be, so you're not carrying loads of stuff with you. Um, there's something from Qigong called the Ha breath. So where you really roll up your fists, and then when you breathe out, you flick out your hands in a big and it's really intense physiologically because you're able to throw off and release stuff that you might be holding on to, which
Mm.
might be what you need to do sometimes between sessions.
Mm.
And the other thing that we do quite playfully sometimes is to shake it off, right? You know, Peter Levine talked about this a lot, didn't he, in somatic experiencing, and you know, animals, you know, are able to shake off threat responses in ways that we forget about or find really, really hard to do,
Yes.
in order to not be stuck in that place where, you know, threat-based responses just keep going or haven't resolved. You know, they're able to do that much more intuitively than we are. So one of the things we no joke that we do in the post session stuff is put Taylor Swift on and literally shake it off.
I, I'm not sure what to say in response to that, although you probably know I'm a fan. So, but I I don't know.
That wasn't just for you, Stan, but also it was. But it's true, and it always brings up a lot of playfulness and joy for people.
Yeah, and also
Um,
just effectiveness. I mean, just that I love that notion that animals do it. You know, you see them all the time, kind of shaking it off when something gets them going, and then they'll wander back, and then at some point they shake it off. You know, it's so interesting, and we forget that, or I don't know, maybe our self-conscious sort of brain comes in, and we sort of don't want to be silly or something like that, but just
I
getting
think you're
back to
right.
that.
It feels like it's a quirk and the trickiness of the new brain, I think, isn't it? It's
Mm,
sort of like it interferes with that, yeah, sort of intuitive capacity that we still do have. But it
mm,
gets in the way of us doing perhaps what our body knows that it needs to do sometimes. And
mm,
it's not our fault, is it? That's back to the key messages of
mm.
CFT. We didn't choose to have this tricky brain and body, but we have it. And then what do we do about it
Yeah.
in order to reconnect with? Because all of this stuff's in us, right? That
Mm,
idea that you already have what you need in you because
mm.
evolution's already given it you. You just need to unblock and unlock it.
Yeah. Yeah. Reconnect to it, and that's the radically embodied compassion.
Yeah.
Well, Clapton, and just for the listeners, we like to call each other just by our surnames for some reason. It's
Very English thing, isn't it?
is it? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right, that's what it is. But yeah, no, thank you very much for that. I mean, I love this stuff. I would encourage anyone who's listening to do the workshops. I think you run them every so often, maybe through the Compassionate Mind Foundation, perhaps, or in other ways.
We have done, but we kind of do it independently at the moment. So you can go to our website,
Oh, yes.
www.fiercecompassion.com, and you can find everything about what we do there and when next workshops are. Also, feel free to email us, and if you're really keen on having a workshop anywhere, we're always open to come in other places if
Yeah.
and when we can in the busyness of life.
Mm,
But it's really something that you need to, in order for it to really be effective, that you need to do in person, right? This stuff's
yeah.
it feels very different doing this at a distance
Mm,
than in together face to face. You really,
mm,
because it's all relational, it's all deeply relational, and
mm.
it feels very different doing this stuff together.
Yes. No, I can sense that for sure. The relational togetherness, the physical side of it, the pair sort of work in pairs that it sounds like you do. Um, no, it's brilliant stuff, mate. Thank you very much for well, all that you do. This is a very specialized contribution that you and Syd have made, and I know a lot of people have really appreciated it, and I can tell from your work that you're really building upon it from a theoretical point of view, but also, yeah, that the way you describe that workshop, it just flows so beautifully and so practically. As a therapist, I can relate to every step along the way. The sort of the
That's the key, really, Stan. It's really practical too. It gets you out
yeah,
of left brain thinky stuff and then into your body,
into your
and
body,
obviously, then you
into your
can go
body,
back into
absolutely.
again and reflect about it. James Bennett Levy said that over there, didn't he, when he was talking about self practice, self reflection? There's plenty of time to do the reflective bridge stuff from the practice that you're doing and bridging it across to your therapist self. All of the
Yeah,
stuff that we do in the workshop will help you out in a really embodied and practical way in the therapy
practical
space.
ways. Yeah. Well, Dr. Neil Clapton, thank you very much for being on Compassion in a T-shirt.
It's been an absolute joy, Stan. Thank you so much for having me, and I really hope I can see you for real again soon.
Yes, hope to see you soon. Thanks, mate.
Yeah. Take care, buddy.